All right, everyone, let's get started. My name is Nick Cullen Carroll. Thank you for coming to my presentation today. The topic is going to be evaluating attitudes toward physical education and sport, and this is an action research project. So, here's a little background information for this action research project. It was performed at Banning Unified School District in Banning, California, which is a small community in Southern California. The school was Banning High School, and at this school we mandate, as well as the state mandates, that there are 2 years of physical education. We have 3 fully staffed PE teachers in our department, and we offer first year PE, second year PE, and then a couple of PE 3 electives which can be taken in the 3rd or 4th year of high school, including weight training, aquatics, as well as aerobics. We have 15 plus sports programs, and these sports are offered in the fall, the winter, and the spring. One of the things that we've recognized in our PE program and in our sports departments are that sport and physical education participation is starting to decline, which is somewhat of the fundamental basis for this action research project. Now, keeping that in mind, one of the other rationales for this project is that psychological and social perspectives offered through individual and group dynamics are part of the physical education standards, not only statewide but nationally as well. But one of the things I've noticed in my practice as a practitioner, as well as in some of the classes in my school and other schools around me, is that we do not seem to make this a priority in physical education programs. So, looking through some of the literature, one of the papers that influenced me and indicated a gap was one by Graham et al. In 2011. And in this particular paper, which we'll cover more in the Lit Review, they showed a correlation between the attitudes toward fitness and the participation of their subjects, not only in the present, so the study takes place over a 10-year gap, but not only while the students were in high school was there a correlation between attitudes and participation, but 5 and 10 years later they showed that same correlation. And so I thought a similar study like this should be warranted in this community, because one of the cultural perspectives that I have is that there's not a lot of support for sports and physical activity community-wide. And that is just a personal opinion, obviously. But I wanted to start evaluating this relationship and understand why this took place. Because if we're going to have this departmental data that we've collected that's showing a physical decline, not only in participation, but in the values of our physical fitness tests, as well as in the participation in our sports, we probably should have some kind of psychological data to show why this is occurring. So our problem statement is that participation for PE in sports is low, and we would like to discover the attitudes of the adolescents towards sport and PE in order to investigate this relationship, which seems to be somewhat connected based on our study that we listed in our gaps section. And the significance of this study is going to be that it will influence the best practices and engagement strategies for the students. It's going to guide the curriculum in the planning for our department. And most importantly, it's going to start this conversation between teachers and students to repair this problem of participation and, let's just say, passion for physical activity. So let's start off by looking at our first study in the Lit Review by Godin et al. Godin et al. Provided us with a scale that tested for assessing exercise behavior. And they formulated a questionnaire that looked at strenuous activity, moderate activity, and mild activity over the course of a week. Then they validated this questionnaire with some body composition metrics as well as a VO2 max test. And what they concluded at the end of their survey, or their study was that the survey was accurate in assessing physical activity as it associated with physiological metrics. The next study that we considered was by Tomic et al. In 2008, and this study evaluated adolescent attitudes towards sport. Now, this particular study was done not in North America, so a lot of the language was difficult to cipher through, and what we ended up doing was taking the questionnaire, which their questionnaire was referred to as Testing Youth's Attitude to Physical Education and Sport, and we took a lot of the questions from there and reworded it so that it would be understandable by our population at Banning High School. In this questionnaire, the authors focused on such topics as social phenomena, participation, and school sport. And they were able to conclude from their results that attitudes did in fact influence student participation in sport. Our next study, a few years later, by Graham et al. Is 2011. We saw this study in the gaps section in the introduction. Again, they were evaluating adolescent attitudes toward PE and sport and physical activity at 0, so a baseline, 5 and 10 years later. This was referred to as Project EAT, and it took place between 1998 and 2008. And they were looking at moderate to vigorous physical activity, and then how that was consistent over a 5 and 10 year period. Attitudes, participation, and BMI were able to predict physical activity later in life from that baseline period, and the authors were able to conclude from that study that attitude and physical activity can in fact influence each other. The final study as part of our literature review was taken by Yaviz in 2019, and this individual wanted to evaluate the relationships between attitudes towards sport, loneliness, and happiness. This individual used the Oxford Happiness Questionnaire, the UCLA Loneliness Scale, and the Attitude Towards Sport Scale to evaluate these high school age students. And the author was able to conclude that sport and physical activity should be promoted among adolescents to foster positive attitudes. The author did find a correlation between physical activity and happiness, but there was no correlation between physical activity and loneliness. So let's jump into our methods section here. Our participants were between the age of 13 and 19 years, and these students were enrolled at Banning High School. They were enrolled in physical education, and they were physical education students, and or some of them were athletes. Every year in our department we have approximately 700 students, which is about 3/4 of our student body. And in this particular study we were able to reach out to around 700 students based on the 3 teachers we have and the Google Classrooms we have set up. And we were able to acquire 245 surveys from those participants who voluntarily chose to participate. The instrument was a scale, in-house designed scale using Google Forms, and it was administered through the Google Classroom, which each class has, as I said. Part of the scale, there were 4 items addressing total exercise hours per week, adapted from Godin et al.'s 1985 paper. There was a 13-item scale addressing attitudes in sport using a Likert style answer scale. And this was adapted from questions from the Yaviz study, the Graham et al. Study, the Tomic study, and the Saffenbaum study. And then we had a single item question at the end, which was more of an unstructured interview question, allowing students to identify their favorite activities and sports for participation. Here is a brief look at our scale. As I mentioned, the first 4 questions are just asking students to identify their exercise habits in hours per week based on strenuous, moderate, and mild, and then a brief question about over a 7-day period, how often are you doing exercise to work up a sweat. Then the next several questions are addressed with that Likert scale. We're going to visit these more in detail as we go over the results. And then the final question you can see over towards the right-hand side is addressing the favorite or favorable sports and activities enjoyed by the students. So let's walk through our methods process real quick in case anybody has an interest in administering this project. You use Google Forms to create your survey. It's posted in the Google Classroom for your individual courses. Each student had the opportunity for one response. There were no multiple responses collected for students. The students and parents were given an email message through a specific software that we use at school called Parent Square to have direct access to parents. This was in regards to voluntary participation and the anonymity of the survey, so students would not be identified with their answers. Students were given a 20-minute period during their finals week. So each period has 2 hours of finals. We administer a physical final and then a written final, and on top of that, we gave them a solid 20-minute period to complete this survey if they chose to, and their parents decided that they were allowed to. Students were instructed to use their phones or assigned laptops. The students were able to finish the survey in approximately 5 to 10 minutes, showing that we didn't need that 20-minute period, but it was nice that the survey was fairly easy to complete. The data from there was collected in Google Forms and transformed into an Excel spreadsheet where we were able to analyze the variables, which are variables that we were analyzing are physical activity times per week, attitudes based on Likert scores toward PE and sport, and then sports and activities of interest. For our design and data analysis, this was an action-oriented project. It was meant to be qualitative in nature. There were some quantitative figures. It was designed to determine the exercise times per week, the attitudes towards sport and physical activity, and the favorite activities or sports of this student population. There were 2 scales and then 1 interview question as a part of the test administered. The Google form for data was used for collection, and then Google Sheets was used for analysis. Physical activity times were collected in frequencies and percentages for mild, moderate, and strenuous time. Likert scales were also collected as frequencies and percentages for each attitude-based question, and then the frequency and percentage of the favorite sports and activities listed in the free response question were converted into a table. Overall, we had a 35% response rate. We sent out 700, received back 245. And we identified some major themes, which were physical activity times, attitudes or perspectives towards sport and PE, and enjoyable sports/activities among the Banning High School adolescent population. Here's our frequency table, but instead of having you stare blindly at a frequency table, I decided to provide the figures as well because I think those are a little more friendly on the eyes. So our first question was hours per week that you engage in strenuous exercise. The majority answered between 30 minutes to 2 hours per week. Then we can look at the hours that they engaged in moderate exercise. The majority again answered 30 minutes to 2 hours per week. The third question was engaging in mild exercise. The majority answered 30 minutes or less per week. And then the fourth question was addressing over a 7-day period or a week, how long do you engage in physical activity that works up a sweat? And the majority of our students said sometimes. Then we move to our attitude-based questions in our findings. Again, we have a nice frequency table here with percentages, but I would like to move to the figures, which are a little more friendly on the eyes, as we mentioned before. So our first question in the top left, and we'll move to the right and then down and to the right. First question is, how much do you care about staying fit? The majority of students gave a 3, second gave a 4. So we would say seemed very much. Next question was, how much do you care about doing well in sports? The majority answered with a 4. Are you proud to be a part of a sports team was the third question. The majority of our students answered with a 4. Do you think professional sports are important? The majority of students answered with a 4. Are there too many sports at your school? The majority answered with a 1, so not at all. Are school sports important to you? The majority of students answered with 3s and 4s. Do you prefer school sports to other activities? The majority of students answered with 3s and 4s there, indicating that they appreciated sports more than activities. The next question was, is sport without competition useless? The majority of students answered with a 1, but we have some strong frequencies in the middle with 2s and 3s as well. The last question on this page is participation in a sport difficult to experience for you? And the majority answered with a 1. The final 4 questions here, does playing or training for sports bother you? The majority answered with a 1, which was not at all. Are you active in school sports or club sports outside of school? The majority answered with a 1, but it seems like we had pretty good frequency all across the board. There was good variety in this answer. Would you like to become a professional athlete? Again, pretty good variety in this response, even though the majority answered with a 1, not at all. And then the last question was, do you prefer watching sports instead of playing them? The majority answered with 2s. The second majority answered with 1s, which we indicated the majority of kids would like to play. So our final theme after the attitude-based scores was based on activities and sports identified that the students favored. And we have our frequency and percentage table on the right, and then our figure on the left. I appreciate the figure even though there's no percentages. One thing I enjoyed about calculating the percentages here was we have to consider that this was a free response question. So the percentages are going to indicate how frequently these responses appeared inside of individual responses. And the way that the table is laid out for you shows you that basketball was mentioned 68 times and swimming was also mentioned 68 times. So if you see multiple sports in here, both of those were listed at that frequency and percentage. So the majority of our students responded with basketball, swimming, and weight training. I'd say weight training is a pretty much tied for first. It's only one response less there. Soccer, running, football, volleyball, and cycling kind of rounded out our top sports there that were above 10%. And then track and field, baseball and softball, jumping, walking, cheer, all in the 5 to 10% range. And then below 5% we see tennis, golf, boxing, jogging. And then we start to see some of the well, I would say more obscure sports for this population, which would be wrestling and calisthenics, hockey, dance, jiu-jitsu, yoga, hiking, stretching, skating, dodgeball, MMA, badminton, tag, jump rope, water polo, ski and snowboard, and bowling, all bringing up the bottom. So now with those findings, we want to get into an action plan and discuss how we actually apply these numbers. In our action plan, I will be the practitioner. The location will be at the same school, Banning High School in Banning. And there's going to be approximately another 700 kids coming in the following year to take part in physical education, with a high probability that there will be some second-year students because we did have a significantly large group of freshmen in this past year. The focus, the overarching focus is going to be to improve physical culture at Banning High School. We want to see positives in participation. We want to see positives in attitudes. We want to see positives in community support. And so our goal in order to achieve that improvement in physical culture is going to be to educate students with the proper tools to be successful, gauge perspectives and attitudes towards sport and exercise, and then gain experience in sport and exercise, which probably should be the general goal of a physical education department. And then the specifics for how we're going to achieve that goal are going to implement learning strategies, lessons, and activities that are pertinent to the student interests and improve participation and positive attitudes towards sport and physical education. by 15% from the beginning of the school year, which is in August, to the end of the school year, which is in May. And you might ask yourself, why 15%? Well, our team goal in this action plan and in our PE department is to have 80% participating every day across all grade levels and classes in physical education. I don't think it's possible to achieve 100% participation. I just don't know if that's realistic. But I do think it's possible to come to a close 95% and have everybody doing something that they at least enjoy in the PE department. Some of our strategies for us to meet these goals are going to be implementing daily dynamic warm-ups and cool-downs. So dynamic warm-ups at the beginning of class after attendance, and cool-downs right before we head into the locker room to change. I would like to administer a brief version of this survey at the beginning of the school year and the end of the school year to make sure we can track attitudes to see what happens with them. Do they improve? Do they decrease? Then we want to implement activity units and sport units for the top 10 most pertinent identified sports and activities based on the past questionnaire. So for us, that would be basketball, swim, weights, soccer, running, football, cycling, track and field, baseball, and softball. Those were the top 10 based on that frequency table, which was based on the interview question of the survey. Some other strategies are going to be to provide guest lectures and lessons from local coaches, as well as maybe some outside speakers, as well as past athletes, past student athletes from Banning High School. Then we want to improve marketing for sports and physical education at our school with more signage in the athletic complex. And we want to track participation. This will probably be heavily criticized because I do not have a specific way for tracking participation, at least digitally, but as of now, we have a point scale and we just use our researchers, which are our teachers, to track participation daily in their individual classes. And then we compare that at our weekly meetings. So our timeline is going to be the following school year, August 2022 through May of 2023, which is the academic school year. Our evaluation techniques are going to be the attitude and activities questionnaire at the first and last day. We're going to have formative assessments for each unit, so each sport we're going to evaluate students' knowledge. And then we're going to have summative assessments, which are going to be at the end of every quarter. We have 4 quarters in our school year. And then daily participation assessments, as I mentioned, it's just a simple 4-point scale looking at warm-ups, workouts, and activity monitoring based on what the activity or sport is for that particular day and unit. Some of the materials that are going to be important for us to administer this action plan are we're going to make sure that we can acquire some swim instructor courses, as well as some lifeguard certifications to be able to use the aquatic facilities. We're going to need to ensure that we have enough sport equipment for each individual and each individual unit or sport. We need to make sure we have weight training certifications for the PE teachers and some instruction courses in order to guide us in how we would implement the proper information for students. We need to ensure we have clipboards or iPads to help us with our daily tracking for participation. We need to ensure that our curriculum is pertinent to the sports and activities that these students are interested in. And then we're probably going to need about $3,000 in funds to acquire these certifications, courses, and then make sure that we have the proper inventory for all of our sport equipment. So, aside from this action plan, what are some of the practical applications of our action research study? So practitioners can use this scale from what we found to understand student activity levels, their attitudes towards sport and physical education, and then what are the most enjoyable activities and sports for them individually. This can also be translated into strategies and lessons or units that will be engaging for the majority of students. As we mentioned at the beginning, the third standard for high school physical education does address group and individual dynamics for social emotional development in sport and PE. This is a tool that we can use to develop that social emotional awareness. This can also help with the improvement of student attitudes, which may lead to improved experiences and participation in physical education and sport. Some of the contributions to knowledge from our action research project would be that students in this community perceive to commit to an average physical activity level based on most adolescents nationwide. We have also determined that students illustrate positive attitudes toward physical activity in this community. More so, we've found that students enjoy some of the more common activities like running and cycling, lifting weights, and some of the more popular sports such as basketball, baseball, swimming, football, and volleyball. And then I think one of the other things that we've understood from this, even though this is a speculation because I did not run a statistical test, is that attitudes could in fact influence participation in this particular culture. We saw an average or slightly above average amount of physical activity as perceived by the individuals, as well as positive attitudes towards sport and exercise. So some of the limitations of our study is that was done in a small community in Southern California. I obviously know, being from here, that Southern California does not dictate the culture of the rest of the country. And it was only high school students that were performing this survey. We also had a 35% response rate, which, when you look at the numbers, obviously 245 is an amazing amount of respondents, and I'm not complaining about that, but I would like to see something indicative of the whole PE department as well as the whole community. There were no physical fitness testing portions of this test, which I think would have expanded the magnitude of this study. And I don't think there were enough questions addressing physical education. Most of my questions addressed sport in itself, and we need to consider that the two could be separate, you know. So for future research, some ways that I want to improve this is to get a higher response rate, maybe add some different translations, because I did have some Spanish-speaking students that were finding it difficult to perform this survey unless they had a translator. I'd like to add some physical fitness tests, such as body composition, aerobic capacity, and strength testing, which we kind of do a couple of those. You know, we do the basic BMI, which isn't necessarily body composition. It's a very indirect version of body composition. But since we already do it as part of a PE program, and for aerobic capacity, you know, we run the mile and the pacer, I think those would be important correlates to a survey like this. And then maybe add some strength testing in, because all kids love the bench press and trap bar deadlift. I think we should expand the study to the middle and elementary schools as well. Maybe add some descriptive data such as grade level, class, sex, maybe what sport the individual claims to be most a part of, and then race might offer some good data. And then in the future, we could also look at assessing the students' abilities to look at their sleep habits, nutrition habits, their moods, as well as their stress levels, because those can all impact their attitudes towards physical activity and sport. So in conclusion, the majority of our students in the sample had positive attitudes towards sport and physical education, as indicated by our survey. Moreover, the students had met the average recommendations for physical activity, more or less. Some of them went a little bit over, it seemed, based on the averages. And then finally, the students in the sample made an indication to the activities and sports that are most enjoyable, as indicated. So what we really want to conclude with is that access to this information may in fact improve our participation levels in the PE department and in the athletic department. And this gives us an opportunity to learn and implement the action plan developed by this project in order to have that positive impact in combating with lack of participation and apathy in physical education and sport. Thank you very much for giving me your attention today. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful rest.